Hello, good afternoon, everyone. We're so happy to have you here this afternoon. Happy Friday. Hopefully it is beautiful where you are. I am Jamie Seward. I am Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations, and I'm here with our special guest, Dr. Mack Zalin, Librarian for Classics, Comparative Thought and Literature, Jewish Studies, and Modern Languages and Literature in the Sheridan Libraries at Johns Hopkins University. Now, before I turn the program over to Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Library, I'd like to thank today's program co-sponsors, the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums, the Friends of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries, and the Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity. I'd also like to encourage you to ask questions by typing them in the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Now, I'd like to turn the program over to Jim Williams. Jim? Hello, Jim. Are you there with us? I see you. We'd love to hear from you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone, and welcome back to the Lunch with the Library series. As mentioned, I'm Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Hopkins Sheridan Libraries. And on behalf of the Friends, I am delighted to welcome you to today's program. This will be the 10th Lunch with the Libraries program that we have presented in a series that started last fall. Over the months, 1,800 viewers from across the United States have enjoyed these interesting programs. I hope you will enjoy today's as well. I would also like to announce that these programs are now available through the Hopkins Odyssey program. So welcome to these new viewers as well. I am excited for today's talk because it highlights some of the unique ways that supporting Johns Hopkins University Libraries impacts our community. Our goal at Hopkins is to be of service to Baltimore and to scholars around the world. If you would like to support the programs and the work you hear about today, please consider contributing and joining the Friends of the Libraries with a gift of $75 or more at library.jhu.edu. I'd also like to thank all of our affiliated sponsors for today's program. Let me introduce Dr. Mack Zalin. He is librarian for classics, comparative thought and literature, Jewish studies, and modern languages and literatures for the Sheridan Libraries. He earned a PhD in classical studies from Duke University and a Master of Library Science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Zalin oversees collection development, reference, and instruction in the Sheridan Libraries for French, German, Greek, Hebrew, Italian, Latin, Portuguese, Spanish, and Yiddish languages and literatures. I can't wait to see which language he chooses to present today's in. In addition to his regular duties at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Zalin serves as the chair of the advisory board of the American Office of l'Année Philologique to the Society for Classical Studies. He is also an ex officio member of the Société Internationale de Bibliographie Classique. His recent contributions to comedias Sueltas will be published in the bulletin of the Commedia Dantes. I hope I've pronounced at least half of those words correctly. Anyhow, I join you in welcoming Mack Zalin to the screen and am very curious to hear about Spanish Sueltas and the history of publishing in Spain. Thank you, Mack.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Jamie, and thank you all for being here on the Friday before Thanksgiving. I know this is an incredibly busy time, so I really appreciate your attending. I'm going to talk today a bit about Spanish Sueltas and the history of the publishing in Spain. And as Jamie mentioned, we welcome questions throughout this webinar. They'll be logged in the chat, and after my remarks, I'm hoping we'll have an opportunity to answer a lot of your questions. So without further ado, let us get started. In October of 2020, the Sheridan Libraries of Johns Hopkins University acquired an exceptionally rare collection of unbound ephemeral Spanish plays known as comedias sueltas, comprising some 1,291 individual editions of plays from the Spanish Golden Age, or the Siglo de Oro, as well as the long 18th century. JHU's new collection of comedias sueltas now stands as one of the largest of its kind in North America. Together with those of the Hispanic Society of America, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the New York Public Library, and the University of Texas at Austin. Pictured here on the screen is one of 3 library trucks worth of sueltas that are currently being processed for special collections at the Sheridan Libraries to join other works from the Spanish Golden Age at the George Peabody Library in Mount Vernon in downtown Baltimore, including just under 100 other comedias sueltas held in the Gladstone R. Fuga collection in Peabody. Now, before we talk about how the Sheridan Libraries are making use of this remarkable new collection of comedias sueltas, we should first describe what comedias sueltas are and, moreover, why they matter. Comedias sueltas are Spanish plays published individually beginning in the early 17th century. The word comedia does not refer exclusively to comedy in English in this context. So it's a false friend. It's a little bit misleading. Well, comedia can actually refer to a dramatic work from one of several genres, though most did in fact have what we would term today happy endings. The word suelta in Spanish means loose, referring to the fact that comedias sueltas were produced individually as self-standing ephemeral chapbooks, as we would refer to them today. Though there are some examples throughout history of individual sueltas being bound together. There are some examples of these at Hopkins in our collections, but they were not actually originally designed to be attached to one another. There's some exceptions to that, and we can talk about that a little bit in the Q&A if you're interested. So as my co-author, Sylvia Spook-Tannenbaum, and I put it in a forthcoming article in the Bulletin de Comediantes, comedias sueltas represent the high end of the low end of printing in Spanish bibliography, is an example of what we term literatura de cordel, or string literature, literally. Literatura de cordel is so called because of the way it was displayed for purchase, as we can see here in this fascinating engraving from 1850, which shows a scene in Barcelona of various works for sale. You'll notice how they're suspended by this string. If you look carefully, you'll notice that some of these actually look like some of the engravings that we saw in the very first slide that we have on our own sueltas here at Hopkins. Now, literatura de cordel encompassed popular and inexpensive booklets or pamphlets, like songs, novels, and poems that were often used for ad hoc purposes, like at-home performances at friends. One of my favorite uses for sueltas, we'll see a little bit later, is that you'll see the number of persons for whom these comedias are designated to be read in a kind of informal social gathering, get-together, plays to be put on at home. Now, despite their relatively low standing in the grand scheme of Spanish bibliography, these are unique testimonies to a tradition that stands apart from others seen elsewhere in the European continent at the time of their production. Now, before we discuss that, let's first talk a little bit about format. Pictured here are the first and last pages of Pedro Calderón de la Barca's El Alcaide de sí mismo in the collection we acquired last year for the Sheridan Libraries. The play was originally written around 1636, but this particular edition was printed by hand in Valencia in 1764 by the press of the widow of José de Orga. Now, of the 1,291 sueltas that we recently acquired, approximately half of those were printed by hand between 1733 and 1834. That last date, 1834, is the commonly accepted endpoint for imprints of the early phase of comedias sueltas. And they're marked, after this period, we see changes in copyright and dramatic tastes that lead to an evolution of the style, which looks a little bit different. So we're going to focus today on the sueltas of the hand press period. Now, this edition that we can see here evinces a number of standard conventions of the production of sueltas, such as caption title or drop title of the Comedia Famosa, lovely ornaments, these typographical features that we can see below, double columns for the text, signatures, running titles, and lastly, a colophon, which gives a lot of really important information for those interested in Spanish bibliography about publication. We're going to return to that a little bit later in the talk. Now, these and other features can be seen throughout comedias sueltas of the hand press period. That is, throughout that century from 1733 to 1834, from the period that we discussed earlier. These features are very helpfully summarized on comediasueltasusa.org, a site that we're going to come back to later on. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here with all of the features because there are many. I want to just point out how complex some of these really are. So in spite of the fact that we're dealing with an ephemeral genre, things that weren't really meant to last, there's some quite intricate aspects of this bibliography. We see, for instance, tailpieces, printers' devices, and some very fancy ornaments. Now, the ephemeral nature of comedias sueltas belies the complexity of these features that we can see. So it's worth taking just a couple of minutes to talk about how comedias sueltas were produced. So the Alcaide de sí mismo, the play we saw just a couple of slides ago, was printed in what we call Quarto Format. Like most comedias sueltas. There are some that were printed in octavo format, but most were printed according to Quarto Format. So what does this mean, Quarto Format? So essentially, we have a suelta here that's comprised of individual gatherings. In this case, they're labeled A, B, C, and D, and they're comprised of the gatherings that are folded twice, cut once to create 4 leaves and 8 pages. Hence, so the 4 on each side denotes the quarto, the 4 in the format. And so when these are all printed, as you can see in the right-hand corner, these individual gatherings are inserted into one another, and they are sewn, they're stitched together on the inside in lieu of what we would think of as formal book binding. So these are self-standing pamphlets. Now, it's important to remember that examples before 1834 of the comedias sueltas that we're considering today were printed by hand using a printing press that was actually quite similar to what we see here. Even though we're looking at a replica of Gutenberg's printing press from the 15th century, comedias sueltas that were hand pressed used technology that was very similar to that was developed earlier in the history of printing. And of any given edition of a comedia suelta, we could expect something on the run of about 1,000 to 1,500 copies on average per edition. Now, it's useful to remind ourselves that in talking about the production of these sueltas, we have to bear in mind that up until the early 19th century, even the type had to be set by hand. This is a manual process from start to finish. So pictured here is a composing stick wherein the movable type would be assembled to be set in that printing press, inked, and then impressed to create the editions that we have. And again, about half of the comedias sueltas we have in the new collection at Johns Hopkins was produced according to this method. Now that we've talked a little bit about format, we should talk a little bit about why comedias sueltas matter and moreover, why we should care. Now, the easy answer and perhaps the facile answer is that comedias sueltas are remarkable and bibliographically unique testimonies to the existence of an exceptional dramatic tradition of Spain in the Siglo de Oro. We have numerous examples in the New Hopkins collections from several masters of the Siglo de Oro, or the golden age of Spanish drama, including 5 editions by Lope de Vega, 5 by Tirso de Molina, and 29 by Pedro Calderón de la Barca. Now, there are also many other sueltas in the Hopkins collection by lesser known minor figures after the Siglo de Oro. So as we can see here, the sueltas are running the chronological gamut far past the Siglo de Oro. We have 1 edition by Antonio de Zamora, who's writing later on, 18 by Ramon de la Cruz, and 10 by Luciano Francisco Comella, whose lifespan, you'll notice, extends up until the 19th century. So in addition to these figures, we have just under 500 anonymously composed works from what we might term lesser theatrical genres, traditionally speaking, from entremeses, these are kinds of interludes, as well as sainetes, one-act farces. And so together, these make the Hopkins collection truly exceptional. And it's, even though each individual suelta is a unique object, together, this is an incredible set of Spanish drama that extends far beyond the confines of the traditional boundaries for the Siglo de Oro. Now, the sheer volume of plays and playwrights attested in comedias sueltas is without parallel elsewhere in the European continent. We can state this without hyperbole. So if we look at this chart here, and if we accept the fact that even 100 of Lope de Vega's 750 or so plays are of doubtful authenticity, we are still dealing with a corpus that is peerless elsewhere in the European continent, in France, Germany, or Italy, in roughly the same period in terms of output and breadth. In fact, depending on how you define the works under consideration, the number of plays and dramatists that we're talking about may actually surpass all of those in France and Germany and Italy combined. It is an incredibly prolific tradition. And we're just talking here, looking here, just about the works whose authorship is more or less secure. When we include those anonymous works, for instance, we're talking about a corpus on the order of maybe as many as 10,000 plays through the end of the 18th century, according to a scholar like Ursais Tortajada. So in sum, this is an incredibly prolific tradition, and one that remains understudied, to say the least, in the Anglophone world. This is another one of the virtues that we'll come to a little bit later in talking about how Hopkins has deployed these comedias in teaching and research. Now, in light of the literary and bibliographic significance of comedias sueltas that we've now started to discuss, we at the Sheridan Libraries wanted to make sure that we put this remarkable new collection to the best use possible. So to that end, we wanted to start by considering preservation and access. Enter the Internet Archive, which began in early 2021 to scan the new collection of J.H. Sueltas, thanks to the support of a grant from the Arcadia Fund, which I should mention is also supporting the digitization of other treasures from the George Peabody Library, as well as hundreds of examples from, for instance, the Women of the Book collection that's being assembled by my colleague, Dr. Earl Havens, which is scheduled to be exhibited in the Peabody Library, I believe, next fall in 2022. Now, I should preface this slide with the caveat. I have not actually seen the exact scanning apparatus that the Internet Archive is using for this particular project. This is an example of an apparatus they have used in other contexts to scan other rare materials. This image here is pictured exempli gratia, just to give you a sense of an idea of what this process entails generally. So you'll notice here that technician has to photograph at high resolution each of the pages individually. And so once those pages are photographed, they come to me as the librarian for Spanish to be checked for quality. I estimate that I've checked upwards of about 7,000 individual pages so far, approximately 2 to 3% of which have had to go back for retakes, blurriness, and so forth. But this is a distinct minority of cases. Now, while this is a time-consuming process, it is difficult to argue with the results that we see. As of today, more than 500 sueltas from the Hopkins collection have already been scanned or digitized by the Internet Archive and can be accessed publicly free of charge at the link here. I encourage you to explore the sueltas at this link here, which can be easily read page by page like a book. Perhaps in the Q&A, we can look at this in more detail. I'm sort of wary of closing out the PowerPoint and trying to get back in. But if there's interest, we can definitely flip through these. The interface is one of the most intuitive of its kind for rare books that I've encountered, and the quality is extremely high. While scans are not a substitute for reading in print, they are still a really useful tool, especially during these strange hybrid times in which we live in the COVID world, being on-site and off-site in a library. We can talk a little bit more about that later on in terms of how the other work is progressing. Now, we expect the remaining Sueltas from the hand press period, that is a little more than 100 Sueltas, to be digitized in the coming months using the funds from the same Arcadia grant. Now, following access and preservation, we have been very keen to consider cataloging information. We want as many people, not only Hopkins, but throughout the world, to be able to discover these Sueltas as possible. So we have here an example of a sainete, or a one-act farce. It's called Los Novios Aburridos. It could be translated variously. Literally, it's something like the bored bride and groom. I'm going to come back to this later in the presentation, talk about what this is about. For the moment, though, this is an example that would be helpful to talk a little bit about cataloging and what we call metadata remediation. Though we'll use this as an example, any number of Sueltas in the collection could apply to the scenario that I'm about to describe. So in order to supply accurate cataloging information or metadata for these Sueltas, we have considered Worldcat, OCLC Worldcat, very closely. This is a union catalog of the holdings of thousands of libraries all over the world, including most major academic and national libraries in the US and Spain. Now, Worldcat records in the world of academic libraries are typically used as the basis for what appears in a local catalog. So the way that this works then is that in most instances, catalogers will take a record that's already been created by a peer library in Worldcat, and they will use that as the basis for a local record in a process that we call copy cataloging. Now, in theory, all that's needed is to just grab that OCLC number and apply it locally to our catalog here in Catalyst. That way, Worldcat can group the holdings of the same edition of the same work together and make them easier to find. Now, the problem is that matching a Suelta here at Hopkins with the most appropriate record on Worldcat is often harder than it looks, because bibliographic information is often lacking, or editions are conflated across records, languages, and countries. So what do I mean by this? So convention holds that Spanish libraries make their own records, German libraries make their own records, and US libraries make their own records. That's assuming that they're all referring individually to the same edition. So this can turn into actually quite a complex problem, being able to match a Suelta on Worldcat and bringing it over into a local catalog. So notice here how for even a really obscure play like Los Novios Aburridos that doesn't have an author that's far later than the Siglo de Oro, this has 10 records, this anonymous play people have written effectively nothing about. So to reconcile a Worldcat record with an edition we have here at Hopkins requires a working knowledge of descriptive bibliography, to say nothing of hundreds upon hundreds of hours of work. Fortunately, I had recourse to hire a graduate assistant as a Denis curatorial fellow in special collections during the summer of 2021 to help with this task of what we call metadata remediation, matching a record that's already been created with a local record and finding the right one. Rhiannon Clark, a now second year's PhD student in Spanish here at Hopkins, trained with me last summer in descriptive bibliography and worked to isolate hundreds of records of comedias sueltas on Worldcat that will be linked to the existing records in Hopkins' own library catalog in the coming months. Now, as we can see here from this spreadsheet, we have the Worldcat number, the Hopkins link, and the link to the Internet Archive scans. On another part of the spreadsheet we can't see, Rhiannon has recorded copy-specific information about the Sueltas, such as marginalia, things that people have written in the margins, or really cool printer stamps, or in some cases, even amazing typographical ornaments, though those are not, strictly speaking, unique to a copy. But those that are unique to that edition, they will be added to the local Hopkins record down the road. Now, I should mention that most of this work was done remotely over the summer, which makes an even stronger case for the utility of the Internet Archive scans. Though Rhiannon was able to come to campus for part of her fellowship, she did much of the work matching these records from outside Baltimore. And this work has been instrumental in allowing us to make headway with cataloging these records, which will continue into 2022. So once we have accurately cataloged the Sueltas here at Hopkins, these records will be added in turn to Comedias Sueltas USA Database. This is a digital humanities project that was conceived by Sylvia Smoke-Tannenbaum way back in the 1980s, following her description of the Sueltas in the New York Public Library. The database ultimately came to fruition and went online about 6 years ago. So in short, it seeks to locate all known copies of Comedias Sueltas in major libraries in North America, as well as in many smaller collections as well. Now, the heart of the website is its database of comedias sueltas printed before 1834 that are held in academic and research libraries in the US and Canada. It is effectively a searchable union catalog to which new records are constantly being added, including, in most cases, scans of the first and last pages of each edition of each Suelta. As of today, I believe just over 24 institutions are currently searchable in the database, and more continue to be added. Now, I want to draw your attention to the fact that Hopkins' new collection will be added along with the corresponding scans that we've already made, but the scans of the first and last pages of the Fluga collection at the Peabody Library at Hopkins that predate this new collection already exist and can be searched in the interface right now. So this is an incredible tool. You can all go on comediasueltasusa.org right now and look at what has already been cataloged from the previous collection. Now, I want to stress that there is more to Comedias Sueltas USA than just digitization of the first and last pages. While this is incredibly useful for identifying editions, there's a lot more going on here. Several other initiatives include a glossary, including that wonderful image of the various components of the Suelta I saw you earlier, which were really useful for training our Denis Fellow earlier, descriptive bibliography. There's also comprehensive bibliography that the best I've ever seen anywhere in the world for this field of study, and a database of typographical ornaments on Comedias Sueltas that are being developed. Now, one of these other initiatives I want to talk about has to do with colophons. Now, as we saw earlier in the presentation, colophons are statements at the end of the work that typically include such information as the place of printing, the printer, and the date. I'm going to zoom in here. This is a colophon from an edition of La Inclinación Española by Francisco Bantes Cándamo that is on the Comedias Sueltas USA database. So we can actually parse, if we read these, the various bibliographic components. So this translates just very, very loosely as licensed in Valencia. Notice a really cool typo there for Valencia. So in Valencia, in the press of the widow of José de Orga, where this, i.e. Comedia, shall be found, and others of different titles, the year 1765. So these colophons are super, super useful in helping us delineate these really important parts of the process of publication, the city of publication, the press, and the year of publication, and additional information. Now, as Sylvia Smoke-Tannenbaum and I argue in a forthcoming article, information systems could be trained to recognize these individual components automatically or semi-automatically across records in cases where these haven't already been identified by a human being. So part of what makes us think this is possible is the work of a scholar named Georg Rem and his team, who discuss what they term semantic storytelling. It's a technique to semi-automatically extract or generate different story paths or plot points towards the goal of supporting knowledge workers in their daily work of processing huge amounts of content. Now, while semantic storytelling is still very much in its infancy, many of the underlying technologies have long been a part of natural language processing and have already yielded really promising results. So what we see on the screen here is actually a case study of the correspondence between the German architect Erich Mendelsohn and his wife Louise that constitutes a corpus of 2,000 individual letters. Now, by focusing on what Rem and his team term movement action items, that is trips undertaken by the author according to their letter from location A to location B to location C using a form of transport, this research team is creating an experimental model for a kind of automated travel log of the Mendelssohns. And it's a kind that provides a kind of story and a means of visualizing how the actors move about. So we can see here in the image documents, the persons, locations, and the timeline that have been extracted semi-automatically from the corpus of letters and visualized very nicely in this image here. Now, you may be asking, what does any of this have to do with Spanish bibliography? So as Sylvia and I argue in our forthcoming article, we believe that relationships can be extrapolated automatically or semi-automatically using our database software. That is to say, our database could be trained to recognize components in a colophon where they haven't already been processed automatically by a human being. We believe ultimately that this could serve to create a kind of network of the book trade as it pertains to Golden Age theater and beyond the long 18th century in Spain. This has been applied with some success in other realms of digital humanities project, but the idea of tracing the relationships between authors, printers, and booksellers in Golden Age Spain has it has received very little attention relative to other geographic domains. So what's more, we think that this process could also add to our knowledge in turn of the biographies of authors as well as printers and booksellers. So if we can take the year of publication, for instance, and demonstrate relationships to press and see publications across thousands of records, it's going to make it a lot easier for us to get a better sense of when a lot of these anonymous figures were working, for whom oftentimes little to no information exists in the major library catalogs, for instance, the National Library of Spain or the Virtual Internet International Authority file. Now, even for the 10% of Sueltas which do not have colophons, a distinct minority, I should say, we expect that contextual data derived from the Sueltas with colophons can enable scholars of book history and typography to supply such missing information as place, printer, and date. We also envision how typographical ornaments could also do this in places where colophons are lacking. They might be able to tell us in a lot of cases who is printing what and where, but that's a project to discuss for another day. Ultimately then, the point I want to make is that network theory can thereby be put into practice and in turn offer new and substantive contributions to Spanish bibliography. Now, comedias sueltas are also the focus of the project I'm supervising for the Freshman Fellows program here at Johns Hopkins. This is an initiative directed by my colleague Heidi Hare, which introduces first-year undergraduates right here at Hopkins to working in special collections on site. The project I'm supervising right now, in addition to providing an introduction to working in special collections, also provides an introduction to translation of a very rare anonymous sainete, the one that we saw earlier on, from the Hopkins collection that has never been translated before, ever, at least in any published form. So first year Hopkins undergraduate Elena Echavarria is hard at work translating this drama right now, which concerns mistaken identity, deception, disguise, and the schemes that lead to a long sought after marriage. You can think of libretto to the Marriage of Figaro, for instance. It's contemporary with that tradition as a product of the late 18th, early 19th century. So it's been a delight to read. And Elena is not only having fun translating this, but she's also considering how she might go about rendering certain scenes in visual art. She's quite the talented painter. So it has been incredibly satisfying and exciting to work on something that has basically never been worked on before in a research setting. And to be able to do this in an undergraduate setting in particular is just incredible. There are certain areas of humanities you simply cannot do this in. There just aren't that many areas in which a research collection could be deployed at the undergraduate level, the graduate level, and beyond, and as these have received almost no attention in the English-speaking world, and we now have one of the largest collections of its kind in the English-speaking world. I would like to close by noting that the possibilities for the new collection of Sueltas are as rich and vast as the Peabody Library, which holds them. I often say that these Sueltas are the gift that keep on giving from the standpoint of research. My entry into the world of libraries was made in large part through my involvement with the Comedias Sueltas USA project after I decided to go back to school after a PhD for a library degree. So it is extremely satisfying to be able to use the skills I acquired in learning about descriptive bibliographies, digital humanities, and many other domains of librarianship in order to train new scholars and inspire new research in turn across the humanities. The projects I've described here at Hopkins and elsewhere in the world at large are to be discussed in an international workshop to be held on Comedias Sueltas here in the Peabody Library in October of 2022, the details of which are forthcoming. Now, before I conclude, I should also mention that the treasures from the Hispanic Society Library exhibit is on display right now until, I believe, December 18th at the Grolier Club in New York City, and this includes a number of Sueltas. In the meantime, I invite you all to start exploring the Sueltas that have already been digitized here at Hopkins. Before you hurry off, though, I will be pleased to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I do see some in the chat. The only way to ask a question is through typing it in the Q&A. I do see a hand raised. We're not calling on people today. So one thing, let's start with this. Sue, the librarian, wonders if anyone in JHU's Center for Natural Language Processing is doing any of this. Do you happen to know?
I do not know, not yet. So we've been waiting. Sylvia and I have been hard at work on getting this article out and have conceptualizing it. We have the theoretical and practical foundation for it, but we have not yet approached anyone at Hopkins to work on this problem, which is it's one that has been studied in other contexts, and we believe it is feasible to put into practice. But that's a good point. Thank you for reminding me of that possibility going forward.
That's wonderful. So I see another question in the chat. Given the performative and oral nature of these plays, do we see a lot of misspellings, typos, idioms that reflect the spoken language more than a written literary language?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question. So the freshman fellow who's working with me right now, actually she just wrote a blog post about this very point in translation. She's a native speaker of Spanish, and she's approaching this as someone who though a native speaker and imbued in that tradition, is approaching an idiom that is 200 years old. Now, most of the time, this doesn't pose a problem. Spanish tends to be quite conservative as a language, idiomatically speaking, but she wrote about one idiom she encountered, something, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. Mal con 2,000 diablos, bad with 2,000 devils. How do you go about translating this, even as a native speaker? So these are, this is an incredible tradition. These are incredible linguistic documents as well, which is one of the really satisfying parts of bringing this over to freshman fellows and using special collections as a gateway to translation and thinking about idiom. So absolutely. And in terms of typos, yes, remember that I'm going to go back to make my point if I can. I'm going to have to close out. There we go. So remember that all of this is being set by hand using a composition stick. So, I mean, when you think about that, it's actually amazing there aren't more errors than there are, especially given the ephemeral nature of the Sueltas. These are not high-end translations of Greek or Latin classics or liturgical works, not really. So so with that in mind, even though these are ephemeral, it's interesting to consider how much care was put into them. These were oftentimes big money makers, so it behooved people to get things right as much as possible. But with that said, there were still often mistakes. We actually saw one in the colophon of this edition. So if you look very carefully here, you'll see Valetia is misspelled. So it's easy enough to intuit how that would have been, but it's fascinating to consider these as linguistic documents in every sense.
Well, this is actually perfect timing because another question is, does con licencia mean something like with permission? The widow had to give permission of some kind to have this performed.
That's correct. Yes. So this colophon shows that this predates copyright, but it's doing something similar to copyright in having this play being produced. A lot of people tried to get around this by creating what we call false imprints or just not having them all together. But there are bootleg sueltas, believe it or not, in this tradition. So in this case, it's trying to show that this is an authorized licensed version. Yes.
Very cool. Well, yeah, I guess they didn't have spell check. So what are you going to do?
That's right.
They did their best. So this is a great question from the amazing Earl Havens. Welcome. How might this collection be used in the classroom at Hopkins? What can it reveal to students about literature that mainstream or canonical 5-act plays might not?
It's a great question. I think just when you think about bibliographic format and what these are doing, these are products of their time, not just linguistically, but I mean, thinking about the format and how these are structured. Thinking of colophons, for instance, we have the text and the context together. This is the beauty of working, of using primary sources and special collections. It's not just a page in the Norton Anthology. Earl and I were talking about this the other day. I mean, and when we see this, we think about peripheral issues of publication, for instance, we see that there's a much broader world in which these Sueltas are existing, particularly if we think about the relationships between printers and publishers. It's and the context behind their production, and just being able to work with these in person and to know that these are not just on a screen. It's an incredible privilege that we have here at Hopkins to be able to work, to see text and context together, which are so often divorced.
It is amazing. It seems that Spanish culture utilized the Sueltas much more than English culture for entertainment. Do you happen to know why?
I do not know why. That's a wonderful question. So Sylvie and I have talked, and she has talked individually about the uniqueness of this culture. I mean, I don't know if anyone has really adequately explained the proliferation of this tradition, that there is, in terms of output and breadth, there really is nothing like it elsewhere in the 17th and 18th centuries. I'm not quite sure how to explain that. Would take a couple of books at the very least, but it's an outstanding question.
We always get good questions from these crowds. It's always impressive to me. So this is another great question. How were these performed? Were they in private, at court, traveling players? And are they actually funny and entertaining?
Yes. So more often than not, so that's a perfect reminder. I wanted to show you here. You can actually see just underneath the title, para 9 personas here, for 9 people. So this is like many Sueltas. This edition is telling you, this is a way of saying, you can do this at home with your friends, with 9 people. It's a way of telling the buyer, oh, okay, this is suitable for this kind of social gathering. And indeed, most Sueltas were performed at home. They were like closet dramas, effectively. With that said, I don't have any examples here. They were annotated quite heavily in some cases. I think in most cases by people who are just getting ready for their parts as actors. But in most instances, these were not for public consumption outside of the house.
Would we ever consider having a group of actors at the school perform one? That could be interesting.
I've thought about that. I mean, I can bring that up with Elena. I know that she's interested more in the visual representations, but I mean, in subsequent years, that could be a wonderful tradition for freshman fellows project, for instance. this is not just the only play in the collection that has not been translated. There are many, many, many more from that are anonymous and from these, let's call them, I don't like to use the term, but they are effectively lesser genres of entremeses and sainetes. They're effectively kinds of interstitial works and interludes that have received almost no attention in the English-speaking world. So these could lend themselves really well to translation and performance. I mean, as it is, it's hard enough to get the major figures from the Suelter performed in this tradition. There are a number of societies that are concerned with that. But no, I think that would be wonderful for Hopkins, and I would support that in this iteration or a subsequent iteration of freshman fellows.
Did people have swelter parties where people would perform these sweltas? Interesting.
Yes, so there's a concept in Spanish of the tertulia. It's a kind of social gathering, and so in many instances these would have been put on at home. So this is the tertulia continues to, it existed beyond the 19th century, but this is like, I don't know, it's like a step up from Kaffeeklatsch in German culture. It presupposes a dramatic culture as well.
So what sparked your passion in this area?
So I learned Spanish from a very young age, and it was sort of my first linguistic love. This is before I discovered Greek and Latin, the fields of my PhD. And when I discovered how Spanish could be a world into the world of librarianship, I was amazed to see how Comedias Sueltas USA took me to it. It gave me an internship at the Wilson Library at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I did my library degree. It helped. I went to rare book school at the University of Virginia, did a course on descriptive bibliography with David Whitesell. So Spanish and bibliography together, I mean, books and languages, that's my whole life. So it's been a natural pair. And it's as I said earlier on, it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's just it's a bottomless well, I think, for inspiration, not only for the language, but for bibliography as well, that remains understudied throughout the Anglophone world.
Well, Hopkins is very lucky to have you. Your passion translates well on screen and in this presentation. I mean, we're really lucky to have someone so excited about this information. I mean, I am now too, so thank you so much. It looks like we don't have any other questions. So with that, I will thank everybody, especially you, for your time and talent. And I'd like everyone, thank you for coming. You're going to get a recording of this webinar and an email that is going to have a list of resources and our event schedule. We do hope you will join us at a future event. We have another one of these coming up soon. You will get an email about that. We do hope you'll join us. That will be on, sorry, if you give me a second here. I should know this offhand, but I don't. We are going to take a tour of Tin Pan Alley on December 10th, Friday, December 10th, virtual tour of Tin Pan Alley at noon. And I will share a link to that event. In the meantime, have a happy, healthy Thanksgiving, everyone. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.